What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another episode of Purple Bear Biology. Here we discuss biology, microbiology, and anatomy. If you're new to the channel, consider hitting the subscribe button to follow more of the videos we already released, as well as more to come. In this video, we are going to explore some of the basic principles of physiology and how organisms maintain something called homeostasis. We are also going to take a look at how size influences metabolic demands of an organism and some really cool adaptations of thermoregulation. Have you ever wondered why so many different body morphologies exist and how so much diversity can still enable organisms to not only survive, but to thrive in very different environments? The secret to that success is adaptation through natural selection. Variation present in the organisms results in beneficial adaptations being selected for by the environment. So environmental conditions coupled with biological needs result in modifications to body size, shape, and arrangement. Of course, there are limitations to what can develop in a body, and primarily the limitation would be the physiological limitations defined by our world's physics. Interestingly, in similar environments, we see similar adaptations develop based on these physical laws. Take, for example, these organisms that spend most of their life in the water. Despite these organisms having quite different evolutionary branches on the tree of life, each of them have developed body plans that enable them to move efficiently through the water. The physics of the water determines that characteristics like smooth and thin surfaces make the body plan more streamlined. While each of these organisms are quite different, the environmental physical laws that they must overcome to thrive in their environment are quite similar. Before we get into the awesome details of modifications to these body plans, let's start with some basics. Let's start with homeostasis. Homeostasis is the stable state required for our bodies to function correctly. Most variables in our body are required to be at a particular set point for cellular proteins to operate correctly. This includes things like temperature, osmolarity, pH, glucose concentrations, as well as many more. You can think of these set points kind of like an AC thermostat in your home. If temperatures rise too high or too low, then the thermostat recognizes the change and either turns on the air conditioner or the heater. Deviations outside of the set point in our bodies can misshapen the proteins and lead to reduced or even completely halt protein function. So what does our body do if homeostatic equilibrium is lost? They use mechanisms called feedback loops to recognize the deviation and attempt to return it to the correct set point. Here's how a basic feedback loop operates. First, the body has receptors to recognize whether or not the body has shifted out of homeostasis. If it has, then it sends that information to the brain for integration and processing. The brain then sends the signals out to try to return the body to the correct set point. When a response to moving out of homeostasis reduces the stimulus that triggered it in the first place, then it's called a negative feedback loop. We can see a good example of a negative feedback loop with thermoregulation in our own bodies. If our body temperature rises too high, then the hypothalamus recognizes the temperature change and sends a signal out to increase blood flow to the extremities, as well as causing the body to sweat. However, if the body temperature is too low, the hypothalamus sends a signal out to constrict blood vessels to reduce flow to the extremities, thereby conserving heat in the core where the vital organs are. This is also what triggers shivering. Shivering is technically your muscles contracting and producing metabolic heat. In either of these scenarios, notice that the response of the body to the deviation out of homeostasis should return the system to their set points and reduce the initial stimulus altogether. Once the body returns to homeostasis, the feedback loop should shut down. Negative feedback loops are the most common in our body, but positive feedback loops also occur. The primary difference is that positive feedback loops do not immediately return the body to homeostasis. In fact, the immediate response often results in reactions that take the body further out of homeostasis. A good example of this is labor and delivery. As a woman's body prepares to deliver a baby, the contractions cause the head of the unborn child to press against the woman's cervix. This results in a release of hormones that increase contraction. Increased contraction then stimulates the body to rev up more contractions. So the response this causes does not shut down the initial stimulus. Instead, it upregulates the body's reaction. These types of feedback loops are more dangerous because of their potential to take the body way out of homeostasis. Because of the potential danger, positive feedback loops must be something called self-limiting. This basically means that the feedback loop has to have the ability to shut itself down to avoid harm to the rest of the body. So how does our body monitor, communicate, and respond to homeostatic deviations? It utilizes your nervous system for fast, immediate responses and your endocrine system for slower, more prolonged responses. Of course, there's a lot of communication between these two systems as well, but that's a conversation for another episode. Okay, so now that we know that our bodies must maintain set points, realize that not all organisms have the ability to regulate these set points with internal mechanisms. Some organisms have the ability to use internal feedback loops to restore homeostasis, and we call these types of organisms regulators. Other organisms require the utilization of behaviors and locations in the environment to maintain homeostasis. These organisms that lack the ability to directly change physiological deviations are referred to as conformers, because they conform to the environmental conditions around them. For good examples, consider the river otter and the bass seen here on the right. The river otter is a regulator, so it generates its own body temperature. You've probably heard of this as an endotherm. As the environmental temperature varies, we can see that the body temperature of the otter stays relatively stable. However, if we look at the bass, the environmental temperature directly corresponds to the internal temperature of the bass's tissues. So, to change temperature and maintain homeostasis, the bass will have to move around in the environment to find the conditions that match the needed set points. You've probably heard of these type of organisms as ectotherms. While this example involves temperature, realize that there are regulators and conformers for all of the set points found inside of our bodies. Regardless to whether we are discussing regulators or conformers, one thing is pretty much universal. The body plan of these organisms influences their exchange with the environment. This brings us to a primary physiological theme we can see in nature. First, the amount of surface area exposed to the environment determines the rate of exchange of materials with the environment. So larger surface areas increase the rate of exchange. This should make sense. If you go outside in the wintertime, the rate at which you lose heat is proportional to the amount of exposed skin you have. More surface area equals faster rate of heat loss. Of course, the situation would be the same if you were looking to gain heat from your environment as well. In addition to surface area, the volume of a tissue will determine the amount of substance that can be transferred. Tissues with low volumes tend to be poor storage sites. Now, while all of this may sound straightforward and simple, keep in mind that this is a huge determinant of the shape and morphology of body plans. Let's use your respiratory system as an example to explain. The goal of your respiratory system is to rapidly exchange gases with the air as you breathe. Oxygen needs to come in, while carbon dioxide needs to escape out. This image on the right depicts some of the possible morphologies that could exist. Inside of your lungs, there are these tiny sacs called alveoli. The body plan must maximize exchange from these cellular sacs into the circulatory system to ensure proper gas exchange. Notice that if the sacs were composed of one cell within a thin membrane, then we can increase the rate of diffusion. However, as the volume increases, when we add additional cells to the thickness of the sac, the rate of diffusion decreases. Additionally, if we change the alveolar structure to include multiple bulbs, the rate of diffusion increases. But just like before, as you increase the thickness of those sacs with additional cells, the rate of diffusion would decrease. Thus, if we were to look at the sacs in our lungs, we can find that they're actually globular, single-celled projections that maximize exchange. Oftentimes we consider the surface area in relation to the volume of structures. When we look at surface area to volume ratios, they do not increase at the same rate as size increases. Surface area increases as a squared function, while volume increases as a cubic function, meaning that volume will increase more rapidly than surface area as an organism's body plan increases in size. This means that very large organisms tend to have small surface area to volume ratios, while small organisms tend to have very large surface area to volume ratios. You may wonder why this matters. And the answer might surprise you. Small organisms like this single-celled rotifer seen on the left have very large surface area to volume ratios, and this means that most of their volume can be directly served by the surface area exposed to the environment. So if the rotifer wants to get nutrients into the center of the cell, it can occur by direct diffusion across the membrane surface. But if an organism has more volume, like the one seen here on the right, they will not be able to obtain necessary nutrients through direct diffusion across their skin. The process would just be too slow due to the volume interfering with the rate of transfer. Thus, larger volumes require that an organism develop body adaptations like circulatory, respiratory, or even digestive systems to adequately gather nutrients and maintain homeostasis. This means that different body systems are developed based on structural morphology of the organism itself. A tapeworm does not need a respiratory system because it's dorsoventrally flattened, meaning that gases can directly be exchanged across the surface membrane. But you have too much volume inside of your body to accomplish this, so you have complex body systems to gather and transport those same gases. Isn't that cool? In fact, all of the body systems we have are manipulations of this principle of surface area to volume ratios. This ratio conversation also leads us to another pretty big physiological principle. The size of an organism influences the amount of energy needed to survive, as well as the rate at which the organism burns through that energy. Let's use these two organisms as an example. Which of these two organisms do you think has a greater amount of energy consumption throughout the day? In other words, which would eat more on a daily basis? I think and hope that all of you would have said that elephants will eat more than a mouse on a day-to-day basis. The elephant just has more cells, so it needs more energy. But what about the rate of consumption based on body mass? Another way to think about this is metabolism. Which of these organisms do you think has a larger metabolism? Though the answer might seem surprising, it's actually the mouse. To figure out why, let's explore this concept a little deeper. So we can see in this graph that larger organisms must consume more food to supply their volume with the necessary energy to survive. But in the graph seen on the right, the rate of consumption of energy is actually larger for smaller organisms. How can that be? This paradox is created because the surface area to volume ratios of these organisms. The elephant has a large surface area, but has a huge volume, making the overall surface area to volume ratio relatively low. This means that the exchange of the elephant with the environment is going to be slower than that of the mouse, which has a very large surface area to volume ratio. The mouse will be losing heat much more rapidly because more surface area is exposed for faster rate of exchange. This means that the mouse must consume energy at a faster rate to ensure homeostasis is maintained. Cool fact alert! Sometimes the metabolic rate of small organisms is so high that they could actually starve during periods of inactivity like sleep. To get around this problem, they actually go into a temporary hibernation state called a torpor. This is kind of like how bears or bats hibernate through the winter, except it's just lowering the metabolic rate during the evening hours as the organism sleeps, as opposed to a hibernation that takes place over several months. Okay, so now that you understand some basic principles of body plans and physiology, now let's finish this episode with some really amazing examples of thermoregulation. As I said before, we have regulators and conformers in these situations. One important note is that regulating your body temperature requires more energy. So we tend to find that conformers like ectotherms invest less energy into maintaining homeostasis. This is why organisms like snakes can eat every few months rather than every day. Regardless of the classification of the organisms, there are some really cool adaptations that enable these organisms to effectively maintain their body temperature. Keep in mind that if we are going to obtain heat or lose heat to the environment, then they typically are going to utilize surface area to volume ratios to do it. Common sources of heat involve absorbing and losing heat through either convected wind currents, radiated heat energy, evaporative cooling, or even direct heat transfer through conduction. Many organisms can alter their blood flow to their skin surface to determine if they release or absorb heat from the environment. In fact, this is one way that you cool off. To further explore this, let's discuss these 5 cool examples of thermoregulation. The first and easiest would be insulation. Organisms can use fat or blubber to increase the volume around their bodies. The increased volume reduces the loss of heat to the environment. This can be hugely beneficial in cold environments, but can be very dangerous due to overheating in really warm environments. The next adaptation we'll look at is circulatory adaptations. A few moments ago, we had already seen how circulation out to the skin can influence heat loss. But some organisms have further adaptations to enable them to manipulate this balance. Wolves and geese are a good example of a principle called countercurrent heat exchange system. Essentially what has developed inside of them is that arteries and veins flow side by side, but in opposite directions. So as warm arterial blood flows out to the legs and feet, it warms the cold venous blood that's returning to the thorax. This transfer of heat ensures that the cold environment does not lead to the cold blood returning to the vital organs and disrupting temperature homeostasis. Some insects do this as well. Bees and wasps are great examples. These cool critters actually have a constricted waist that causes circulatory fluids to have to channel through a small area. This results in the heat being conserved in the thorax and keeps the insects warm around the flight muscles so they can protect themselves or fly away. In the heat map on the right, you can see the yellow and red heat trapped around the thorax while the abdomen is much cooler. Of course, sometimes the goal is to get rid of heat rather than hold on to it. Many organisms will use the principle of evaporative cooling to accomplish this. Essentially, as water absorbs heat, it will transition from a liquid to a gas. When the gas evaporates away, it takes the excess heat with it. So some animals like dogs or even birds pant, exposing large moist tongues to the environment to release heat. Did you know a bird could pant? Other organisms like insects maintain their body heat using behaviors. Bees, for example, will cluster together and vibrate to generate heat through the winter months. Dragonflies will even bask in the sun, maximizing the amount of surface area exposed to absorb heat. Some insects even produce heat through a process called thermogenesis. They do this by shivering or flapping their wings to generate enough heat to fly off. If you've never seen this, then try leaving a light on outside to attract moths and wake up early the next morning before the sun rises. Give the moths that show up a little gentle poke, and you will see their wings start to vibrate rapidly as they attempt to generate the heat needed for flight. This kind of cool adaptation is best seen in the cool months of spring and fall. Wasn't all of this physiology amazing? I hope you found this to be a helpful video to explore some of the basic principles of animal form and function. If you liked the video, be sure to like it and share it with your friends so they can watch the awesomeness that is physiological adaptations too. As always, thank you all for watching, and see y'all next time.